So black folks here in the United States, clearly there's also diverse religious communities here. And we see, especially in the 20th century, the emergence of large black Muslim communities. But it's not only to Islam that black folks migrate, but also to Judaism. This is a photograph from Harlem 100 years ago. So there is a long history of black Jewish communities, and it's important to talk about them. I'm not going to go too deep because we're trying to move back to Israel to describe that legacy. But just, as there's a long history of back to the land, back to Africa movements, here there's also not only a non-denominational Pan-Africanist movement, there are also Jewish back to Africa movements. And we talk about the Hebrew Israelites or the Black Hebrews, and there's lots of different communities, various different communities, and they all have their own flavor. But one of these communities decided that they would not only practice their own variant of the Jewish religion, but that they would also become Zionists, essentially African-American Zionists, that they would not only become Jews of a sort, but they would also move to Israel. And so we have in late 60s, early 70s, and then in the 80s, continuing this group called the African Hebrew Israelites. They were based mainly in Chicago, some folks in Detroit, DC, and other US cities, and they decide to move to Israel outright and to form an intentional community there. This is actually where I live. I live in the city of Dimona in southern Israel, in the deep south of the Nakab Desert, or the Negev Desert. And they arrived there in 1969. Now, at that point, Dimona is a speck in the middle of a dust bowl. At the time that Israel was established, it didn't even exist. The day before Israel is established, May 13th, 1948, the Prime Minister of Israel, first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, he actually says, I want Dimona to be the capital of Israel. No one agreed with him. Jerusalem became the capital. But this was his idea. He wanted the center of the country to be in the Negev. In any case, when he said this, there was nothing there. It was just desert. But he wanted to control as much land in Palestine as possible. And so he wanted Jews to inhabit that land. Now, at this point, there are Jewish folks moving to the country from all over the world. If you were Ashkenazi, if you were a Jewish person of Northern European or Eastern European extraction, you could decide wherever you wanted to live. You want to live in Tel Aviv, you want to live in Jerusalem, whatever you wanted, you got your wish. But, if you were one of these people whose ancestors were from Morocco or Algeria or Tunisia or North Africa, and you decided to move to Israel at this time, what you found was that you were sent to these desolate areas of the country where nothing existed yet. The government needed you to be a foot soldier, so they would send you there. And they sent you there against your will. So the city of Dimona, here are the first arrivals in the town of Dimona. It wasn't even a town yet, it was just a tent city. Nothing but tents, shambles. You see the Arabic writing on their luggage, because as I said, they came from the North African nations. And it was just desert as far as the eye could see. And they came there against their will, because the government had told them, you're going to Tel Aviv, if you can imagine this. They get on a boat in Fez or Casablanca or whatnot. They sail to Haifa, the port of Haifa, northern Israel, Palestine. They get there, they're put on trucks, they're thinking that they're going to Tel Aviv. They're told they're going to Tel Aviv. They ride hours and hours and hours with their kids and their luggage, and they finally, after hours and hours, they're like, I didn't realize Tel Aviv was so far away. Finally, at the end of the day, it's close to dusk, the trucks drop them off, and they're in the middle of literally nowhere. And they realize that they've been lied to and deceived by the government that they trusted. In fact, of the first 5,000 inhabitants of Dimona, 2/3 of them were sent there against their will, which is a remarkable figure that, again, I imagine that very few of you have heard that statistic before. But this is well documented. So these are the tent cities that they land in when they come there in the early 50s. Eventually, of course, Dimona is built up into a town. Today, there's about 35,000 folks living there. population of Dimona. Now, as I said, it was Jews from the Middle Eastern countries and from North Africa and what we call the Mizrahi communities. And so when we look at photos from that era, we see a lot of folks who dressed like other Arabs, right? Because that's who they were. They were Arab Jews. So a lot of traditional communities, the traditional communities were the ones that first populated that areas we would say the Jews of color, we could call them. And so these are Jews from North Africa. A few years later, we have Jews from India moving to Israel, and they too are sent to these towns in the middle of nowhere, arriving in Dimona. And so when the first African Hebrew Israelites arrive in Israel in 1969, I guess the immigration officials at the border are just like, okay, you're a brown, black Jew. Okay, well, what do we do with brown, black Jews? Oh yeah, we send them down to Dimona. So they send them, they're arriving years later, they sent down to Dimona. That's how it is, that's how it came to be that the Israelites live in Dimona. Now, when they first arrived there, because they stated that they were in fact, we are Jews, and we've come back to live in the land. So, okay, sure, I guess that's also possible. Black Jews, sure, why not? So they were accorded all the rights and privileges as any other Jewish immigrant to Israel. They were given free housing, free furniture, all kinds of other economic incentives to make the difficult challenge of immigration a little bit easier for them and their families. So we see that they start establishing the beginnings of their nation, of their culture, of their community. But it didn't last long, because after about a year or so, local folks started realizing, wait a second, the Judaism that you claim to be practicing isn't like our Judaism. This is a different Judaism. Y'all are practicing some kind of Afrocentric form of Judaism. That's not the real Judaism. That's not authentic. And so the government gave the community an ultimatum. They said, you got two choices. Either you now convert en masse to our form of Judaism, the authentic form of Judaism in our eyes, or else you can leave. You have no right to be here if you're not Jews. Well, the community leaders were offended by this demand, and they rejected it outright. And the government's response was, okay, you're not Jews in that case. And that means that in that first year, a few people, some of the early immigrants were, they were mothers and fathers and grandfathers as well, and grandmothers too. And so there were a couple folks who actually died in their first year, natural deaths. And when this happened, once the government decided that you're not real Jews and we want you gone, they actually, if you can believe this, they exhumed their bodies from the Jewish cemetery and then just went to the edge of town and left them there in what became the African Hebrew Israelite graveyard of Dimona. And it was very quickly turned into the dump of Dimona. Folks in town would go there if they had any construction, garbage and they needed to get rid of, that's where they would dump it. It's a really sickening story that barely anyone is even aware of, but this is at the edge of town. This is where I live. This is one of the last photographs of it, actually, because just in the last few months, they've bulldozed over it and they've built a new neighborhood for Israeli soldiers who need to be housed in town because they're stationed at an army base nearby. So they're building new neighborhoods for soldiers on what was the African Hebrew graves. They do now, and just in the last few years, they now, because the government realized, okay, maybe we went a bit too far. But at that time, in the 70s, in the 80s, they were treated like garbage. And we can see, so, how do we know this besides the historical record? Because I went into the Israeli government archives to see what they were writing about and what people were writing about them. And so these are some of the letters that I found in the Israeli government archives. So when Israel decides that we don't want these black folks, these African Americans who've come here, and we're going to kick them out, and they start kicking them out, they start rounding them up and sending them back, taking them to the airport and putting them on a plane back to the US. So when this happens, it comes out in the news, Americans start reading about it, seeing it on the evening news, then we start to get responses. And it wasn't, again, it wasn't across the board, but certainly in the writings we see people writing to Golda Meir, the Prime Minister of Israel at the time. Or actually, sorry, to the President of Israel at that time. And they write, in tonight's TV, we saw that Israel was expelling black people, women and children. Israel did the right thing. There is never an hour, night or day, that black people don't commit purse snatching, rape, and robbery. They bring drugs to white women. Israel should make a law. When a black man commits any crime, he or she could be expelled to another country. Now, far be it for me to say that this is what every Jewish person thought or felt about the treatment meted out to these African Hebrew Israelites. But this person his wife was the president of B'nai B'rith of San Francisco. Okay? So this is the establishment Jewish voice. Now that's here in America. In Israel, we have Dov Shilansky, who went on to become the Speaker of the Knesset. Okay? He says in the Knesset debate of what to do about these African Hebrews, he says, we need to be putting the Hebrew Negroes on a boat. And then, as the conversation in the Knesset developed, people called and to drown it at sea. This was how they were treated. Now, in the mid-'80s, at this point, it was the peak of the Israeli government crackdown on the community. And they would just arrest people en masse and deport them willy-nilly. And so the community said, enough is enough. We can't accept this anymore. We need to stand up for ourselves. So the community got together and they said, we are going to do a peaceful protest. We're going to march on Jerusalem, which probably would have taken about 3 days, but that was their intention. They got men, women, and children all dressed in white, to make it a powerful visual symbol. And they set out, they had provisions, and they are about to set out on this mass, walkathon to Jerusalem to protest, to state their piece in front of the Knesset. And once they do so, the Israeli army just circles them. They send in hundreds of troops, tanks, helicopters, and guns aimed at little babies, saying, you're not going nowhere. You aren't walking a foot outside of your community. You're staying right here. Of course, they pushed them back. They didn't allow them to proceed, so that protest didn't occur, but at least there's a visual record of the attempt to do so. And because there was a visual record and people started to hear about it, well, that had an effect. It had some effect. I guess the Israeli government realized this is a Hasbara apocalypse. We can't defend this. When people in the United States see these images, this is already the mid-'80s. So this is no longer acceptable, at least, in a liberal discourse. So the government realized, what? There's only like 3,000 of these people. Yeah, we don't want them here, but maybe we need to bite the bullet. And so the government decided, all right, we'll cut our losses. We will allow them to remain in the country. However, they can only do so if they send all their children, boys and girls, to serve in the Israeli army. Only if you adopt Zionism, essentially. And up until that point, we can say perhaps they were Zionists in the sense that they moved to Israel and made it the center of their lives, but they were also anti-militarist. They didn't want to participate in the organs of the state in that way. But I guess the leader of the community decided that that's what was required if they wanted to not be deported back to the US, which they were dead set against. So they caved and they accepted the deal. And so now the community does send its sons and daughters to the Israeli army. Sadly, they're not citizens yet. Even though they decided to sell out in that way, it didn't pay off because till this day, maybe only 5% of the community has citizenship. They say, if your kids serve in the Israeli army, after they serve in the Israeli army, then they can apply for citizenship. And then if they get citizenship, then you, the parents, who've been living here for 40, 45 years at this point, then you can apply for Israeli citizenship. But because of this bureaucratic rigmarole, as I said, a handful of people have achieved this citizenship so far, not more. So I guess in some sense, it was a measure of success. They managed to have a foothold in the country, but what was lost? You won't see photos like this anymore. This is captured at that time, back in the 70s, 80s. You see a group of Hebrew Israelite singers, and they're all wearing different clothing styles, but the one second from the right, where he's wearing a turban, that was once a very popular mode of dress in the community. You'll never see that now because that's associated somehow with Orientalism or Arabs or Muslims, and so that's been excised from the wardrobe of the community. You won't see that anymore. So that was the deal that they had to cut in order to establish a right to continue living in the land. So that's the story of the African Hebrew Israelites. That's one of the African communities in the country.